try again?
Thank you very much for being here. Again, I'm Stefan Yost. I'm the Michael and Sonia Kerner Director and CEO of the Art Gallery of Ontario. We're a kind of sprawling institution. We're always revising history here, too. And we tell histories we all know, and we're also encouraging perhaps different histories. It's my pleasure to have Two Ships by Kent Monkman here, and there's 3 different versions, and it's not yet part of our collection. Kent really is mindful of art history, and I don't mean that casually. He's extraordinarily knowledgeable about the history of art. He's also mindful of social histories and also his personal history. So you have 3 histories working simultaneously, and his project is nothing short of epic. He's using narrative history painting to basically rewrite the history of painting, which isn't easy to do. It's been a massive project, and he does it through artistic excellence. He does it with boldness when it comes to the truth, perhaps in telling stories that we may not want to know about. And he also does it with an incredible sense of humor, all 3 of them working pretty well together. Joining him on stage is Wanda Nanabush, who's the AGO's Assistant Curator of Canadian and Indigenous art. And I would say Wanda is best known internally and externally as a cultural warrior. So I'm going to have them both join us on stage.
Thank you, Stefan. I'm sure you enjoy my warriorship all the time. Welcome, everybody. Really happy to be here this afternoon. Thanks for coming to the session, and welcome, Kent. So we are here to discuss an unfinished painting that Kent has hung here. And I'm so pleased to be hosting this conversation. I am not Sarah Milroy. Sarah Milroy lost her voice, so I had to step in for her. And I also want to thank 6 Degrees for having us all here. We are live streaming at the Cedar Brae, York Woods, and Toronto Reference Libraries. And all of you simply attending via live stream, thank you for being here as well. We're very lucky to be in the presence of this painting and such an exceptional artist. A bit of background about the Two Ships and how it came to be here. John Ralston Saul and Charlie Foran, they went to your studio, I believe, and saw some studies. It was about 20% complete at the time, and they really felt it was important as narrative, as art, as a visual metaphor for the historical, political, cultural, and perhaps spiritual moment we are all in together. And we're going to talk a little bit about those aspects of the painting in a minute. First, I want to talk a little bit about the structure. So shortly, Kent and I will have a close-up conversation about the creation of the work. Then we're going to invite, and here it says me, to the stage, but I'm already here. And then we're going to invite Bernard Schlenk, who has a particular interest in European romantic and political art. And we're really happy you're here to come and share your thoughts on Kent's painting. And finally, John Ralston Saul will join us on stage to contribute his thinking to this work. We will have time in between, 2 times, to be able to discuss with the audience as well. So get your questions ready. But to start, I want to ask you, Kent, maybe where you began and why such a huge painting. What were you thinking?
Good question. Is this working? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're good. You're good.
It's on. Yeah. You just have
Definitely
to. Definitely
on. Okay. All right. Well, this project began about 3 years ago, and it was a commission that I pitched to some American collectors that were buying my work for the Denver Art Museum, and very, very, very good collectors. And I wanted to make a very large history painting, and so I pitched them on the idea, and they accepted the commission. And I got started on it. And like most of my paintings, it began with a little sketch. So I did a little thumbnail sketch, probably not any bigger than that.
We can show the sketch, actually, if you want to see it on the screen here.
And the collectors agreed to the commission. Now, subsequently, there was some illness, and they weren't able to follow through with the commission. So, if anyone has a very large living room, this Monkman will be available soon.
John, do you have a wall for it?
So.
Yeah.
The next step in this project, I'll come back to the intentions and the whole concept after. I'll just talk a little bit about the process first. The next step was to translate this little pencil sketch to the small study size, which I did over 6 weeks about 2 winters ago.
Again, we have the images. There we go.
Yeah. And I've been working with assistants in my studio for about 10 years, painting assistants, and we took this image and we projected it to that size, and we realized that there wasn't enough information in the study to help my assistants make the work. And up until pretty recently, I was doing all the figures myself, and I thought, oh my God, like I'm going to be painting this thing for 10 years. So what we decided to do, and we already started doing this in my studio practice, was bringing models in and photographing them, and then I could give my assistants better source material, and it actually gave me better source material too. So I ended up having much better source material to work from as a painter, and I'd always resisted, using photography, I guess because I felt it was like cheating or something, because I'm such a purist when it comes to painting. But when I really thought about it, as this is kind of, it's an homage to French painting, and specifically to Delacroix, and I'll talk a little bit about his process. But Delacroix was using photographs and working from photographs of models. So I thought, okay, it's okay, I can work with models now. So what we did was we brought models in, and we staged a shoot and got costumes and got the models into my studio and basically recreated the scene. Well, not all together, but in bits and pieces, and that furnished the source material for the second study. Now, the first one was already underway, and it was kind of in progress. Well, several months into it, and so we kind of took a step backwards, painted over the areas that had been started, so we could sort of update it with this new information. As you can see, my assistants work from iPads now. So we have this system in my studio, which is kind of very much like the atelier system that the old masters would use in terms of me giving a lot of direction to my team.
So you got to hold it like this.
I got to hold it like this.
Or nobody will hear a word you're saying. And
this work here, as you can see, it's still in process, and I was at first a little bit reluctant to reveal an unfinished work, but I liked the idea that it was going to be here in this studio environment, and that it sort of fit the idea of this forum. We're all sort of works in progress, and we're all sort of like working towards improving and coming together. So you'll see a lot of Naples yellow underneath the painting here, and that's a technique I got from Delacroix. So I read his journal, and he talked a lot about color, and there was a lot of really useful information in Delacroix's journal just about painting. But I wanted this piece to really speak to the relationship of Europeans and indigenous people. And I love French painting, so in many ways it's an homage to a number of French painters. And the image is based on a reading or the interpretation of the Two-Row Wampum Treaty, which is the oldest basically treaty between the indigenous people, the Iroquois and the Dutch, so dating back to the 1600s, so one of the first. And then from that treaty, other treaties are based on that. So it's kind of foundational in terms of how indigenous people understand our relationship to European peoples. So the idea, the image, I was really drawn to the image that it evoked because it was two rows of purple wampum beads symbolizing the course of two vessels, a European ship and an indigenous canoe traveling in a parallel course and not interfering with each other. So the idea really was a peace treaty. And as we know, the treaties have been misinterpreted. the way indigenous people understood the treaties when they signed treaties, or whenever there was a treaty made, there was a very specific idea that indigenous people had in mind, which of course was
peace and friendship,
or the sharing of the land, sharing of the resources. So, and Europeans understood that as that they were signing over millions of acres or what have you. So, I wanted the painting to really feel like that moment of where these two vessels are about to collide, and it's a seascape. It's a stormy, turbulent scene, and there's a number of different references. So.
Yeah, one I was thinking, and for those of you who don't know, the Turo Wampum, it's 1613. But this is, when I first saw it, I was thinking of the Raft of Medusa immediately for the Jericho painting. And also partly because in that painting you have this very ambiguous moment where the ship is coming. It could save them, but it also might not be saving them. And that kind of ambiguity, and I was wondering if you were drawing anything from that painting into this.
Absolutely. And, I'll talk a bit about some of the other citations in the work and just kind of stitch together. I mean, I'm always a bit reluctant to, say too much about the work because,
okay.
You want people to sort of see things and interpret their own things from the work. But there's a number of different sort of characters on that raft. It really is a shipwreck that represent different, personages from European history, historical characters and mythological characters. The canoe itself, I was looking at Bill Reed's Spirit Canoe actually for inspiration from that, but also Delacroix's Christ at Sea. And that sort of, when I thought about Delacroix's Christ at Sea, that sort of gave me the rationale to put mischief in that boat, because the parable of Christ at Sea was that here is this leader and his disciples, and he's fallen asleep, and the stormy sea is threatening to sink the ship, and they're all terrified, and meanwhile he's blissfully asleep. So I kind of saw this as mischief's wet dream, and this is she's having this dream, and she's maybe about to wake up. So when she wakes up, does she calm the storm? So that was this idea of a storm brewing, or potentially about to destroy what is happening. But there is this incoming moment where she is going to wake up. So that was kind of, and then there's a number of references in the canoe there to Bill Reed's Spirit Canoe, but also to Paul Kane, a painting by Paul Kane. So when I was thinking about how can I represent the West Coast cultures, I actually went back to Paul Kane's painting, Medicine Mask Dance, which was very much about his artistic license and sort of bringing masks that didn't belong together to make up this image. So that's really what I love to do, though, is to quote from art history and to sort of bring images together that can kind of stitch together these references. Mischief in the Boat is also referring to a painting by Girodet, which is Sleeping Endymion. So Diana was kind of bathing his body in moonlight, and so there's a kind of a sexual gaze on the body as well. So it's probably going to be another 6 months or more until it's finished, but it will be premiering at the Canadian Cultural Centre in Paris. There's a new space that they are launching in May of 2018. So if anyone is in Paris in 2018, that will be the official launch. Don't tell Catherine Bedard anybody, because I was supposed to be holding the premiere for that, but it's not finished, so I can get away with this, right?
Yes, and it is in a gallery school, so we're okay, I think. It's interesting, you were talking about this kind of relationship to French painting and Delacroix, and also being at the Cultural Museum in Paris. And I remember the last time I was there, I was with Robert Houle, who was studying Delacroix and also did work for there. What do you think our relationship is to Europe in this way as artists?
Well, I mean, I make history paintings like this because it was such a grand tradition of painting. In many ways, it sort of reached its zenith in the 19th century. And as I track art history, I'm looking for how art history has portrayed indigenous stories or has not portrayed them. So the relationship that indigenous people have had with the French, I mean, it goes back a long time. And indigenous people were traveling to Europe for a number of different reasons. And Delacroix, for instance, sketched some of the indigenous people that were traveling through Europe with George Catlin. So there's a long history of indigenous people going and looking at Europeans. And a lot of my work is about that reversal of gaze, using idioms of art history, of romantic painting, of history painting, to talk about these back and forth relationships. It has never been just a one-way relationship, so I think I just love the richness of pictorial history that can tell stories, and so I've really kind of moved away. I used to work more abstractly, and I decided that I wanted to work with a language of painting that was much more complex in terms of the layers that I'd be able to bring to the work.
Yeah, there's a funny story about actually close to here, the Mississauga of New Credit. One of their members, Mungwadas, had traveled to France in like 1847 he became one of Delacroix's studies. And he wrote a book about his experiences, and they couldn't get over how hairy the French were. So it just tells you a lot about, these first kind of meetings, right?
And he was shocked that they couldn't, they weren't taking care of their poor people.
Yes,
so
this was the most shocking thing.
The amount of wealth, and then the disparity between, the wealthy and the poor.
Yeah. So let's go back for a second to this idea of the two ships. We have the European ship, and we have an indigenous ship in the original wampum that was done, and they're traveling in parallel directions. So at the time, there was this belief that that's where we would be, that the one principle of non-interference means that nobody can put their laws on another people. So now here we are today in what's often called the time of reconciliation or something like this. Do you see this work making a comment on that in some way?
Well, if you go back to the original treaties, they were made between sovereign nations, and what's happened subsequently is that that relationship, the Crown kind of shifted their responsibility to the Canadian government. So those treaties really don't hold up because they were between sovereigns. And when you have people like Chief Spence, who, during her protest in Ottawa wanted to speak with the Governor General, is because she wanted to speak legitimately with the sovereign who her treaty is with. Mm-hmm. And so, these are the things that I'm thinking about when I'm making a painting like this, because I really want people to think about those treaties and how they're interpreted.
Right, and yours is a shipwreck, so what does that say?
Well, I love the richness of the allegory of these ships about to collide, and just two ships passing in the night. For me, it was just a fertile terrain that could sort of layer the image and give it complexity.
Who are some of the figures that are on the raft or the
Well,
ship?
without identifying, or really trying to close it off, there's someone that maybe could be Columbus. There's someone that maybe could be Queen Victoria. There's Liberty kind of in there. There's a Viking. There's a Minotaur who is sort of like Napoleon. So I was trying to integrate mythologies as well. How indigenous people sort of think about cosmology, and how Europeans have their own mythical characters, and so those are kind of present in both ships as well.
I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions as well, because I'm sure you have many. You've been staring at it for a couple days. So are there a couple of questions from the audience at this point?
Okay, there's one over here. I'm just going to pass you the box, and you will stand up. You're ready to catch?
Giselle.
This gave me a lot of anxiety because I was terrible in sports. Kent, would you like to talk about what Miss Chief is doing in the canoe?
Well, she's asleep, and she's dreaming, and ostensibly it's an erotic dream, because in the small studies she has an erection. So
So
that's why I
this is
called it kind of a wet
post?
dream.
This is post-erection moment?
Well, I haven't added it yet to the large study. I was worried at how big it might be at this scale, so I didn't want to scare anybody off. So come back and see it in Paris when it's finished.
Do we have another question? There.
Oh, sorry. Excuse me. You ready?
It relates to that concept of scale and size. Can you talk about creating something of this size and how that changed your approach to the work?
Yeah, well, it's certainly the largest painting I've ever made, and I probably will never make a painting this big again because it's a real pain. Even just moving this painting here, I mean, the organizers can tell you there are like hundreds of emails sent, and the logistics of just handling a painting like this. It had to come off the stretcher, and then I work with a skyjack. I don't know if the skyjack is in the pictures of my studio, but I have a skyjack in there, and like I said, I've been working with a team directing people. It's just it's an enormous amount of work. It's probably, it's like 4 or 5 times what I normally do. But it's also, the reason I wanted to make it that big was, history paintings typically are very large, and they have an impact, and they really give you that sense of awe about what the narrative is because they're so big, and you can kind of lose yourself in them. So, the raft of the Medusa at the Louvre is 14 feet tall, so mine is actually 2 feet shorter. It's not quite as wide, but I like that 2-to-1 ratio, and that seemed to fit the concept of the piece as well. But yeah, there's a real shift that has to happen even in terms of the brushes, like the brushes are like this big, for part of the painting. So it's a real learning curve for myself and for my team, and it's also just been a really great challenge, but it's just been in the studio too long, so I really, really need to get it done.
One of the interesting things, because it is a so-called history painting, but history always in this sense that includes fiction to a certain degree, because you're including people who never would have existed in the same place and same time, and it sort of reflects back onto history painting and sort of draws attention to the fact that that's true of most of the history painting that we sort of take as truth, like the death of General Wolfe or something like that, where people paid to be at his bedside or his death side in the painting. So I want to bring up Bernard. I would love for you to head up here and join this conversation. Coming from Germany as a writer, an art historian, and a jurist, we really want to know what you think.
I'm really not an art historian. But let me begin there are several reasons why I'm grateful for having been invited here. And one is that it got me in contact with your work. And when I learned that I would see these paintings of yours here, first I saw them on the internet. That was good, but seeing them in print was already better. And now this is really wonderful. And I love German 19th century art. So if ever you come to Berlin, don't miss the Alte Nationalgalerie, where this art is beautifully presented. And I love paintings that tell stories, and particularly paintings that tell stories that I don't fully understand. It's the same with poetry. I love poetry that I don't fully understand. So as with your 4 continents, I have looked at them again and again, and I know and like Tiepolo's 4 continents. It's something that I can look again and again and get into it deeper and deeper. Here, I also don't understand all the references and all the iconic people that you Canadians immediately understand. Well, what I see is 2 ships, and the left one, I mean, it can't even be steered, this poor ship. It can just go where the wind drives it, and right now the wind drives it into a collision with the other ship. no way out of the situation unless the canoe turns sharply to the right. And it doesn't look like it's going to do that. So two ships, I don't see them as parallel, but on a collision course. And the people, the poor white people, they could need a little more sun. I mean, their gray white skin compared to these healthy indigenous people over there. But if you look at the faces, they don't look that different. And here the guy put a boar's head on his head, and there is a mask. So there's a similar sense of being and hiding and presenting oneself and not presenting oneself. And what I particularly like, it's a confrontation on all levels. So they want to shoot at each other, they want to greet each other, they see the beautiful naked women here and there, they are dressed or not dressed, so they communicate on many, many levels. And John, at the last round, talked about the indigenous social model or models. And I can even see this in it. So the white people seem somewhat lost on their ship. They can't steer. They are much less together among each other than the indigenous people over there. And the indigenous people can row their boat. They can give it direction, what these poor guys seem unable to do. So maybe it is even something about different models of being together in a difficult situation. Okay, so for many reasons, I love it. The story that I understand and the stories that I don't understand, and that invite me to look at it as other work, the four continents, again and again. So thank you for this painting.
Thank you, that's a very high compliment. I'll just add a little note, because for me painting, you never really know, even though there's this process, you don't really know where it's leading you. And one of the discoveries for me in making the painting was about the parallels that happened with the things they were wearing on their heads. So, and that didn't happen. I wasn't really aware of it until after I'd made my first study, and then at first you're aware of all of the differences, and then you start to see the similarities. So that was something that was kind of an interesting discovery for me in making the work. And then with how it's going to be exhibited in Paris, I'm going to be curating headpieces from a museum in Lyon, and we'll be showing those with the works to show indigenous head dresses and European helmets and things like that, just to kind of create these, these parallels to emphasize the similarities as well as the differences.
Just hold it like this. But what happened? I was sort of curious about something you were saying, where it almost sounded like you were saying one of the ships could rescue the other, maybe, or is that some of where you were going with some of your thinking around one being a healthier kind of situation than the other?
Well, I mean, the collision can only be avoided if this ship turns sharply to the right. And this ship, at least, is able to steer. This one is just driven by the wind wherever it blows. So, yes, the active element is on the right. The more passive element is on the left.
Do you have something to say about that, Kent?
Possibly.
Is that how it makes you feel? That wasn't some of your intention, though.
No, I mean, yeah, sure. Of course, I was thinking about that. I wanted the indigenous vessel to have agency and power and to be mobile and moving. But it's not black and white either. I mean, there are people in that canoe that want to assist and those that don't. So You know, I think it's important to have work that's also explores a different range of, you know, possibilities, not close it off for interpretation too easily.
Yeah, it doesn't feel binary, for sure. What happens when what do you think about when you're placing these kinds of different things together, like a mask, indigenous mask, and a helmet from another culture?
Well, like I said, I was really trying to just represent, you know, almost, you know, iconic characters from the European, in the European vessel. Those parallels just sort of happened almost by accident through the creation of the work. You know, using the indigenous mask, it began as an homage to Bill Reed's Spirit Canoe, because he had Raven in the canoe, and there's a bear, and a wolf, and so I wanted those characters present, and then I kind of, you know, winked at Paul Kane for his, you know, appropriation of indigenous masks. So it was a way to kind of also bring the story back to, you know, how Europeans have lensed indigenous cultures and the problems that lie in the art history that is here in North America and in Europe about who indigenous people are. And so much of my work is about how museums represent indigenous people, and so a lot of my work is working with museum representations and collections, that kind of thing.
We have a question from the audience, quickly.
Did you have a question? Yeah, someone.
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for sharing the painting. I'm just curious, I don't know if it was intentional, but I'm seeing in the raft that the man with a kind of Roman helmet and the other man that looks like a kind of, could it be Spanish conqueror, are the only one looking at the Minotaur that you equaled to Napoleon, and the other ones are looking other way, so I don't know if there's a message behind that, or it's
possibly
pure. I can't help but notice that. I'm sorry.
Well, you know, one of the things, again, when it comes to creating a composition like this, is you want to create relationships with all of these, you know, characters and figures within the painting, so that, you know, you're making stories within stories. And for me, it was about, you know, again, studying these great paintings and really analyzing what made these, you know, the paintings that I admire so much, what made them so fascinating. And that's what the old masters were so good at, was storytelling with the human body. Very subtle things like how someone would look at another person, and how grief could be portrayed in the human body. And so those are things that I've really looked at and really learned from in my own practice, and I always come back to it. And my most recent body of work that is touring Canada right now, in the Shame and Prejudice thing, was really about understanding, you know, how emotion is so important to a narrative painting or a representational painting. That element of emotion is an important layer that I really wanted to develop in my practice.
I think you wanted to respond again.
Yeah, I only was referring to military power and political, imperial, so to speak, power, because they're only one like interacting directly, and if it has something to do with, I don't know, some kind of Western way of doing politics for centuries.
Yes.
That's where the question
No.
came from.
Well,
Please.
we're getting right.
You just have to hold the mic against your chin.
It leaves so much space for the viewer's imagination, because even though it's serious and political and critical, it's at the same time it's funny and playful and ironic. And so, as I see it, even though there may be Columbus or Napoleon or whoever, and we remember all the things that they did, we are not bound to that. We can, as viewers, also play with all the things, and you invite us to play with them.
Absolutely, and so not every layer has to be understood by every viewer. That doesn't matter to me, and so the art history geeks are going to really enjoy it, maybe a little more than some other people, but that's what I think, you know, the power of representational image making, as I've learned as I moved away from abstraction, was how wide my audience could be. And I realized that the things that were important to me, I needed to reach a wide audience, because you're going to have a very circular, closed conversation if you're only speaking to your own community or your own microcosm, you know, in the art world. Like for me, it was really about reaching people that don't know anything about art history, reaching the European settler cultures that we live in, and then the Europeans who live in Europe, and you know, because this is part of their art history tradition, so they can instantly recognize, you know, the citations and the references. And so for me, it was about trying to reach a wide an audience as possible.
And Miss Chief sure likes to be played with.
Maybe.
We have a question over here.
It's a bit of a question and also a comment. So as I look at the piece, I think about how the interplay between the narrative that has to be created for settler populations to interact with indigenous populations, regardless of where they are in the world. Some of that narrative that plays out in mythology and iconography ends up needing to infantilize the iconography and mythology of indigenous communities so that a settler community can explain its own clinging to a superior narrative. So when I look at some of the mythical creatures of folks on the raft and how we've come to understand those as essential foundations of history and classical civilization, and the ones in the canoe as playful and playthings of a less evolved or less complex civilization. So it doesn't jump out as them being parallel. It doesn't seem to me that the narrative is parallel or equal, to use that term. That's my comment.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. Wanda, do you want to speak to that one?
Well, I think historically, this is the narrative that is told, right? That indigenous people are treated as lesser civilization, all this kind of thing. And the iconography for sure can look like that. And for sure, our art practices sometimes circuit through Western art and circuit through its concerns. But I actually think what Ken's trying to do is circumvent that entire narrative entirely. So like to resituate power within an indigenous context and to resituate European art from an indigenous perspective such that it's not a binary, nor is there a hierarchy.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, Europeans came here and they created, you know, the foundational myths of Canada and the U.S. are flawed in that, you know, they came and they conquered, and it's about European supremacy here. But, you know, that's just purely through the lens of the European eye. You know, from an indigenous point of view, you know, a canoe makes way more sense than a different kind of vessel on this landscape. So, again, it's all in the eye of the beholder and how you perceive it. I mean, I've had indigenous people look at my work, and especially ones that are, you know, of landscapes, and what they see is very different from what a European would see, just in terms of understanding what they're looking at. You know, the mountains are our ancestors, our grandfathers, and you know, there's a very different cosmological way of just understanding what you're looking at. And I think indigenous people will read my work differently. And I think, again, it comes back to a language that is very open and can be read by different people with different perspectives.
John, I want to bring you up here at this point. Join us. I'm sure you have some words on the history of this country and its representations.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's on. I should just admit first that I'm a big fan of Kent and have been for some years, and he did my, it sounds really strange, but he did my official portrait for Rideau Hall. And so it's the first official portrait in Rideau Hall. And those official portraits go back to, well, the earliest thing there is sort of about 1850. And it's the first one done, obviously, by an indigenous artist and one of the greatest artists in Canada today. And we did have a number of interesting conversations about whether Miss Chief should appear in the official portrait.
I tried.
He put a big attempt, but you know, there are moments.
Would you have been sitting on Miss Chief's lap? I could see that.
Well, everything's possible, you know. Everything is possible. There was a lot of balancing in kayaks, if you like, and in with very cold water if you fell out. If I remember rightly. But it's a wonderful portrait. I have not because it's me, but because it's him. It's a really wonderful, and people love it there. And the other thing I was going to say is I actually don't agree, so I'll be even blunter, I don't actually agree with the idea that the indigenous masks are somehow playful or lesser. And I think that there's been an enormous move in the art history, the understanding of indigenous objects over the last 100 years to where people actually treat these objects almost with more nervousness and care than they do Western images. I mean, you only have to look at the agreement in what's now called the Museum of History in Ottawa, where the rooms with certain masks have to be in darkness and you can only look at them through slats because elders have said these must not be exposed to light. So there's an agreement in the art history world in Canada that, and I'm just being very limited here, in the art history world in Canada, that Indigenous objects must be treated in a way which is understood to be correct. So that, for example, the whole argument about whether totem poles should be saved, which is the European idea, as relics, or whether, according to the elders and the nations, they should be allowed to return to nature, which is a different philosophical attitude towards the relationship between people and nature. That argument went on for how long? For about 20 years or 30 years, something? Longer. And in the end, Indigenous people won the argument, and it was decided one of the greatest sites in the south of Haida Gwaii. The Haida would decide what happened to them, and I saw them 25 years ago, and they're slowly rotting away. So they have not been neutralized as objects in the European sense. They've been allowed to return to nature, and people like Hunt and I'm trying to think of the other names, the great sculptors of our day out there, are building new ones, right?
I think that was part of the 2 points. One that you're making around the worldview is completely different. So it's not an object, it's a spirit, it has a life, all this kind of thing, especially if they're feasted. But also another thing you're pointing out is that if a culture continues to practice and produce and change, then that notion of preserving becomes less necessary in that way. So it's coming out of that whole salvage kind of ethnography that was like, we are going to pass off into the distance and we will die out.
Yeah,
but
so
here we
it's
are,
actually
sitting here today,
yeah,
not dead, not dead.
You know, what you're doing is and this decision is a real defeat for the anthropologists, you know, and the social Darwinists and all the rest of it, who said, isn't this wonderful stuff that we can stick in museums and it's all over, and instead of that, you know, you could argue that, you know, a great number of the most important artistic explosions in this country over the last 50, 60 years have been indigenous, and there are of which Kent is one of the most important contemporary ones, and I think this painting is a remarkable thing. And, you know, I can't remember who said it, but it was Kent who said it. I mean, Canada is the only colonial creation where when the imperial powers came, they were unable to impose European means of transport. So this is the only country where they couldn't really use horses much until they got to the prairies. The wheel was totally useless. You know, try a wheel in the Canadian Shield. You've got 15 seconds before it breaks, you know? And so that actually the Europeans were obliged to, with Indigenous people, use the canoe. And we used the canoe in forms of the canoe up until we did the railways. And the roads came third. This is one of the maybe only countries where the roads came third, not second. And so, you know, up until the 1860s, 1870s, it was still the water, the rivers, and canoes of some form or other. So there's a really, I don't know if it's, you know, the two-row wampum or a crash. I love this idea that the only one that can move is the canoe, which is true about Canada. It's the canoe. All of us who've canoed know it's the only viable means of transport, unless on the waters in many, many cases. And I love this sort of, something's gonna happen and nobody understands what it is. And there's a lot of misunderstanding. Already you can see the misunderstandings. And the kind of assurance of the Minotaur, which it's like the Champlain statue in Ottawa, where Champlain's up on the hill pointing, like, you know, European romantic, right, up the Ottawa River, which is the way into the center of the continent. And he's saying in the statue, you know, come on, boys, that way. Whereas what he's really saying is he's looking over his shoulder to the people who've invited him to get in the canoes, probably Wyandots, and saying, where the hell are we going and what is that? You know, so it's a very interesting, the self-assurance, which is the foolishness of the Minotaur for me. I don't know. Does any of that make sense?
Possibly. No, I mean, this for me makes me really happy, because when people can read into the painting like that and pull things out and pull these layers of meaning out, it really resonates with my own intentions. So it's just nice to hear that.
Can I add one other thing?
No.
Yeah, no.
Yes, of course.
There was a show in New York in 1984. I always forget the name of it. Very important show. Do you remember this?
Primitivism and Modernism.
Primitivism and Modernism, and it was a very scandalous show.
At the MoMA.
You've read about this. You're too young to know about it.
I've written about it.
You've written about it. So you may not agree, but my memory of it is that this was the first show that actually had Picasso and Braque and everybody else, and beside them were all these sculptures, etc., coming from Africa and the Pacific and I think on both coasts and things. And the art historians went nuts because they said, well, I mean, this is European art. It's not derivative of primitive art, right? And so it was a very interesting moment, this realization, because there were the photographs of Picasso with his painting and the mask beside it, right? And so in a funny kind of way, I feel that, you know, Kent, in some of these historical paintings in this one, is turning that whole thing on its head. Like he's saying, well, I'm taking advantage of a very interesting but primitive school in Europe and making it indigenous art.
Well, that was my thinking. I mean, a number of years ago, people were like, they would ask me, what is your work like, expecting it to be woodland school or what have you, and then I would show them these paintings, which are very much from a European tradition of painting. And, in my own thinking, I was making it a Cree tradition. I was making a Cree painting. It's about your worldview that is in the work itself. It's not the actual medium itself. I mean, Cree playwrights write plays. They write symphonies and operas, and it's the medium itself is really just the vehicle through which you express your worldview. So I like that it sort of disrupts and challenges, I think, those perceptions that people have about the kind of work an Indigenous person is supposed to make.
It's a bit like Thompson Highway inverting the classic big play. You probably don't know Thompson Highway, no? Well, he's Cree, Northern Manitoba, and he's famous for particularly two plays, gigantic plays. They're 3 acts, I think, both of them. Dry Lips Ought to Go to Kapuskasing and
Res Sisters.
Res Sisters. They are like incredibly funny and cruel and massive. And they're very hard to read because they're essentially oral. And on stage, they're just overwhelming masterpieces. And it is the same thing. It's taking a European form and making the indigenous dominate it. Really, you would love them, actually.
I think it's also about the location of culture. So when somebody else is in power, they kind of decide where your culture's located, right? Like if it's in a bead or if it's in a feather or where it's located. I think artists, generally, they decide where their culture is located. So if you don't see it as a European painting, actually, you see it as a Cree painting, which is sort of locating the culture where you would want to locate it, which is in a more complex place. which relates to what you were talking about in terms of Indigenous art history and how it's been sort of located in the museum. Thinking about putting all those masks, as you were talking earlier, in a boat, traditionally that wouldn't have been done. Bill Reed is the first person to kind of do that, and you're taking that even further. So there's a way in which art itself has this kind of role to kind of push culture around a little and open it up. Would you say that?
Well, for sure. And I mean, we influence each other. So there's a back and forth exchange that has been happening for a really long time. So, you know, we don't live in bubbles, and we never have. So, you know, there was a metaphorical way of resurrecting a dead tradition of painting to say that, you know, a through line to history and tradition is important, so don't wipe ours out. So I think, you know, by flipping it around and saying, look, here's a valuable, very valuable form that you have kind of walked away from, I see value in that, but I can see value in it because I'm an outsider looking at it and saying, this is really good stuff. Why aren't you guys looking at this anymore? You know, so that was kind of my take on it.
That's funny. The first show that I curated of Kent was called Res Erection.
Well, you nodded when she said, oh, is it a Cree painting? Is it a Cree painting or is it a Kent Monkman painting who uses and plays with whatever he enjoys to use and to play with? And there are Cree elements and European elements and history painting elements, etc., etc., etc. So is it a Cree painting?
Well, I've just said that in a way to sort of make it my own. So I'm using the medium to express my own point of view.
I want to open it up to the audience. Are there questions in the audience? We don't have a lot of time left, so the burning ones, do it.
Hi, I just had a question around, I guess, mischief and what I'm assuming based on the smaller painting is Jesus, and they're sort of both off-center in the paintings, and mischief, as you said, is rising from a dream, and again, from what I can see, Jesus has been taken down off the cross. So is there a symbol there around them being the spiritual center of the canoe and of the other ship?
Well, I guess, you know, you make certain decisions sometimes just instinctively, and sometimes it's just about solving problems with the composition too. So, you know, I wanted Mischief, of course, to be the star of this painting, and you know, as the painting kind of further deepens in its tonal ranges and stuff, I'll try and sort of, you know, get the spotlight right on her. But it was really just about wanting to have her take a central role in this sort of sprawling scene. But a lot of it is just, you know, figuring out the composition and making those choices sometimes instinctively and then working through them.
We had a question on this side as well.
Hi, I'm Jay. I have two questions. One, it's easy to see the variety, historical variety on the European side. I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about the diversity of characters in the canoe. I don't see that as clearly as I should. Second one is I'm kind of wowed by the whole concept of you having all the apprentices, and I'm amazed at the detachment of someone who can allow the brushstrokes of other people. I mean, I'm a writer, and I go back to look at my own writing, and just even with my own stuff, I can't believe that idiot, you know, did, you know, created that sentence or whatever. So I wonder, I'm curious about your sense of detachment and to what extent you let the apprentices' work stay as the final statement.
For sure. Well, in terms of distinguishing the characters, it's still quite unfinished, and I was hoping that through this, the idea of the headgear and the headdresses and the way that the different nations would distinguish themselves, that will become more apparent as the painting gets finished. That was something I was thinking about, the fact that there are, like, you know, Niska masks, you know, painted by Paul Kane in a canoe where there's also a raven, and, you know, so I really wanted it to be kind of representative, but again, you know, it is a painting, so there are limitations to what you can fit in. The whole process of having assistants was definitely something that I had to kind of go on a bit of a journey with, because of course, you know, as an artist, you become kind of you're obsessed with your own hand, but you know, over the years I've trained a number of different painters, probably about 8 or 9 by now. Some of them who have already moved on, but that became a really valuable and interesting project for me to entertain in my own practice, because it also improved my own practice, because it forced me to articulate exactly what I was doing. So I would have to analyze exactly what I was doing and why. Which brush do I use to do this and why? And so just being able to articulate, and in fact, I've barely touched this painting so far. That is through the orchestration of many hours of me directing my assistants through all the different steps required to get it to this point. Very specific things that have to do with the size of the brush, the kind of brush, how you load the paint on the brush, how you drag that paint across the canvas. Very, very specific technical things that I had to really understand myself in order to teach people how to do it. And it's physically impossible for me to make a painting like this you know, in less than 10 years, unless I have a staff to help me do it. So it was really good in terms of understanding my own process well enough to be able to explain it to people who are at different levels of their own artistic journey as well. So very, you know, sort of emerging artists that have moved very quickly in terms of their ability to understand and process, because no one ever told them how to actually paint. So in my studio, it's really different than being in an institution like OCAD or anywhere else, because no one can really tell you how to paint. You have to, they kind of guide you. But in my studio, there's a very regimented way of making a painting, and there's a very regimented way of loading your palette. And so you know, the more senior the assistant, the more they can actually pyramid down, like train the newbies. So it's been a really yeah, it's been a really amazing process to teach people how to do that. Now, you know, the medium-sized one, I've spent a lot of time on that one because there's so much resolution that had to be brought to that, and the study I did entirely by myself. And then this, for me, that's only about 40% finished in my mind, because I still have to come in and really put the layers on top. But, you know, through that, I'm also watching them daily. Sometimes, you know, I leave it for a day or two and I just give them direction, and then I come back and I'm like, oh, that's really good, but it needs to be darker, it needs to be cooler, it needs to be this, or it needs to be that. And it's been really helpful just understanding my own process.
It's interesting because when we first met, it was at the Imaginative Film and Video Festival, and when you're talking, it sounds so much like filmmaking and the process of creation in that way. But also the big European masters also used assistants and apprentices and everything like that. It's been going on forever, I think.
I mean, I think it's worth adding, to what you said, which is European painting, massive painting, and church painting has always been based on the painter controlling and having a large number of people helping them. I don't think there's an exception to that rule. I mean, whether it's Giotto or, you know, or Delacroix or Rubens, they all directed people and doing it. And I think the way you've just described it, this control over how to use the brush in your studio, and that makes perfect sense to me. It's very different from the individual writer, where, you know, it's a very, very different kind of process. But isn't there also a very interesting link with the indigenous tradition? And I might say this wrong, in which case correct me, but the way I've always been told it by indigenous great artists is, and by most people, which is, there isn't this idea that, well, that's the artist, you know, and that's the businessman, and that everybody feels they have a role in art, but everybody knows who the great artist is. So that there isn't this kind of exclusion that there is in Western society today. Oh, well, only the artist, you know, can touch the canvas. And I mean, remember, Ada and I were on Haida Gwaii, and it was Jim Hunt, wasn't it? Yeah, we're up in the north of Haida Gwaii, and Jim Hunt, one of the great artists, Haida artists, was doing a new totem pole, which would take forever. And everybody in the community was coming out and carving with him. But boy, was he controlling it. And I can tell you, and he said to Adrian and I, would you like to do a bit of carving? But we were put to the task of the lowest of the low, I can tell you, because he knew he didn't have time to teach us to do anything intelligent. So we just sort of removed a bit of wood, you know, that would later be dealt with by someone more skilled. So I think that idea of the, you know, this is the opposite of the romantic creator idea, where it's only me, it's only my heart and soul that's at play. Instead, it's much more in those two European and I think indigenous traditions.
Well, I think there is this idea that art is part of everyday life and everybody gets to partake in some kind of sense of creativity in the community. But as you said earlier, there is the artist, the one that's the master of the beading, or the master, the one that you go to because they're the kind of the greatest at it. I don't think you would see yourself quite like, I think you think of yourself as an artist. So that maybe start there.
Well, yeah, I mean, but I also get a lot out of working and I see my studio as a collaborative environment. So, yeah, there's a bit of the top-down stuff because there is a point where they can't do anything unless I'm there weighing in on it. But, you know, I choose talented young people and really encourage a lot of collaboration. So they're bringing ideas to the table, and they're also bringing their own skills and their own creativity. And, you know, because I don't just make paintings, I make, you know, film and video and installation, and there's a lot of things. And so I'm very fortunate in that having a team also gives such energy to my practice, because it's never static and it's not always reliant on my level of energy. Sometimes I'm just like, I'm burned out and I'm just not able to produce that day, but my studio is in full effect. You know, there's 8 of us, eight assistants now. So we're very busy, and that having that energy always present really gives me more energy back. So it's really a back and forth.
It's beautiful. Sorry, did you want to say any more? Are there more questions from the audience? I think we have one right here.
It's not really a question. It's more of a comment answering back to Bernard's question of, is it a Cree painting or is it a Kent Monkman painting? I'm a Filipino-Canadian person and I make rock music. But is it white music or is it Filipino music? Because I wrote it, you know, and especially when I'm telling stories of my parents' migration from the Philippines. And suddenly, there's not just a white audience listening to this rock music. Suddenly, there's young Filipino women washing in the front, you know? And especially in a conference that's speaking about inclusion and talking about, is this a Cree painting? Is it a European painting? You know what, when I go to the AGO and I see these like 15th, 16th, 17th century paintings, and I'm appreciating the technique, I'm like, okay, I'm tired of this story. And I see Kent's painting, and it's telling another story, which is, you know, an indigenous perspective, an indigenous story, and it's opening up like the audience and who's included in like appreciating and looking at the art and who's being represented. So, you know, one day when Kent Monkman is dead, it's still going to be a Cree painting with a Cree audience, inspiring young Cree artists and other, you know, artists of all kinds who don't feel included when they go to this gallery and see these white paintings. So
I think
yes.
you're right. It is about narrative and what kind of stories that art is telling. And I know you started to touch on that, Kent, but do you want to talk a little bit more about the importance of narrative in your work and the stories that you're telling?
Well, you know, I mean, a large part of my work over the last 20 years has been exploring, you know, why and how, and for all the reasons, indigenous perspectives were essentially, you know, not included in the telling of the art history of North America. And we know why. It's a European settler version that exists in all our museums and that still continues to feed how museums represent not just that version, but how Indigenous people fit into it. Now, we've had a lot of forward movement in Canada, more than in the United States, and I go to the States often, and I you know, do projects with museums, but I feel like they're a generation behind. They're you know, you were talking earlier about just how do you work with allies? Well, allies give the space to the Indigenous people to have their voice, not you know, curate the shows for them. So it's made such a huge difference in Canada to see Indigenous people working as curators in museums and institutions. That is where we're seeing the big shift. And people will institutions move very slowly. I mean, someone could be in a position for 20, 25 years in an institution, and then that's really problematic. That chokes off momentum and movement. And that's what I see happening in the United States, is that they're still doing this top-down kind of form of representation and curating of Indigenous stories, but it has got to shift, because it's not going to move and really shift how Indigenous narratives are represented in museums.
May I ask, I found very interesting what you said, how teaching your apprentices makes you think about what you're actually doing, how you brush and how you pick up the paint. I don't know how Rembrandt did it with his apprentices. Did he just do that, or did he also tell them, oh, in this corner I need something, I think a saint should go there, and then the apprentice goes and paints the saint? Or whether it was just fill out what I have designed. So how is it for you? Is it just filling out what you have designed, or could you also imagine saying to one of your apprentices, well, I want a horse there, so put a horse on the raft?
No, that's a little too loose. Like I still have quite a bit of control, and then with the I think what was useful here is seeing that course of this image kind of come from that little sketch to the study, because that really shows you how it came to be. Now, sometimes there are things where I give them a little more room, and I think filmmaking is for me is a little more collaborative in that way. But when it comes to a painting, I'm very specific about it. And the one character at the front of the canoe there with the paddle, I think that's the third time he's been painted, because the first two times it just didn't work, and I was like, it's got to get painted again. And so. I still have still retain a lot of very specific control when it comes to that, and I think my assistants, they are there and they understand that they're not there to put their own point of view in my work. They're there basically to paint, and they want to paint the way I want them to paint, so that's their job. And the ones that do well in my studio really understand that, and the ones that don't get fired. Just kidding, just kidding.
We have a question out here. Giselle.
First of all, I just want to acknowledge the work that Wanda Nanabush has done as an incredible curator here at the AGO. Like, we're all really grateful for your perspective and what you brought.
Thanks.
But getting back to Kent's work, I think we haven't really talked enough about the sexiness of this painting and your work in general. And just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the use of sex and the power dynamics of politics and history, and also humor and its relationship to Cree storytelling.
Well, sexuality was such an important part of the early work that I did in this direction, with cowboys and Indians, and, they were like basically just very erotic images. And for me, that was about really wanting to present a very empowered sexuality. Indigenous people, we've been institutionalized, we've been colonized, we've had our sexuality repressed, the traditions of two-spirit people, of the Berdache, of the gender, the third gender, stamped out by the church. I really wanted to have a very empowered sexual persona in the persona of Miss Chief, and she's unabashedly saucy, and she's very powerful in terms of her own sexuality. And so in this image specifically, I mean, I know it's called Two Ships, but it really is Miss Chief's wet dream. And it's just it's just for myself, as I think about this. No, I really it's about our dream world too, and just being able to dream positivity and to imagine ourselves as powerful people, and our sexuality is so deeply embedded in who we are as human beings, you know, and it's part of our tradition of storytelling too. There's very sexual stories in our Wasagachuk stories, and you know, so the sexuality is super important.
Funnily enough,
Those bells aren't very sexy.
don't move. Miss.
Thank you for visiting the AGO, and we look forward to seeing you again.
I love other people getting involved in other people's titles. Actually, Miss Chief's Dream, not Wet, Miss Chief's Dream would be a wonderful title for this.
Wet. Say it. Say it. Say it, John. Say wet.
No, I don't mind saying wet dream.
It's wet dream.
It's a seascape. They're in water. That's what I was thinking. What were you thinking?
No, I think actually Miss Chief's Dream is that idea. You want to make her the center of it. In a way, that makes her the center of it because she's dreaming this whole thing, you know? The whole thing is her dream. And then she becomes this very powerful, powerful figure. Sorry, I didn't say anything. Forget it.
But there is a direct relationship, I think, that you're pulling out, which between colonialism and the suppression of sexuality, right? So I think to look at indigenous forms of sexuality, which are quite diverse, it can be quite liberating for the whole colonial project. Like, it could liberate everybody. Okay, we're going over here. Adrian.
I know Kent's work from years and love visiting the studio and seeing everything. And of course, Miss Chief is this hugely powerful sexual symbol. And she's particularly powerful in your videos. But where she comes to her apogee for me, and I think in many ways for you, Kent Monkman, as a Canadian artist, is her performance before the Fathers of Confederation. And there she is dancing in front of the Fathers of Confederation, lying down. Wasn't she lying down or was she dancing? Perching provocatively. So that you are attempting, it seems to me, in that, to give a view of our nationhood or our confederation, which we're celebrating this year, 150 years, which contextualizes it in a sexual way, which we, of course, in history don't do. We don't think of anything in terms of our history, in terms of sexual either domination or in sexual urges or anything like that. And that's what you bring to the history. That's what you bring to your massive piece at the entrance of the new Museum of Fine Art in Montreal with the wolf and chant. Everything is there, the whole fresco, but it's all eroticized. So it makes me think of a kind of mainstream that we have in Canadian art and letters, which is not all that much recognized. It's in Leonard Cohen's beautiful Losers, which I'm sure you've read and interiorized. And it's in the Autumn Matisse Refus Gobel, when they look for magic, for art. If that isn't sexual, I don't know what is. And so that's the tradition you're in. You're not a Cree artist in that sense, attempting to look at Canadian history. You are in the mainstream of what Canadian art is doing. And you're trying to energize it in this particular way. And the fact that you are Miss Chief, and that you play Miss Chief, and that we see you as Miss Chief, and we see you as Miss Chief in the videos, and we see you performing Miss Chief, is of course even greater, a greater impact, because you, the artist, are not just portraying it, but you are it. Hmm?
So you're mainstream, dominant, and full of urges.
Well, you know, I wanted Miss Chief to be a little bit dangerous, you know, when I created her, because I wanted her to disrupt this very static, sort of safe version, which for me has all these submerged layers that, you know, don't get talked about. And the fact that, you know, I came across a George Catlin painting, and it was this painting called Dance to the Bear Dash, and it was a ritual honor dance of men dancing to that male who lived as a female, and it was honoring her. And I thought, well, what happened? What happened to our own communities? What happened to, society at large, that this has been so repressed and stamped out? So I wanted Miss Chief to be that provocateur, to really go in and sex it up.
How about Miss Chief's very wet dream?
Ooh, look at you go now.
I'm trying to get beyond the single erection to something larger.
Now we're going for multiple erections.
Or the wetness of Miss Chief's dream. How about that? There's something in there. I just don't...
We will help you find out. So on that very wet note, I think we have to bring this session to a close. But it's been a pleasure and an honor to discuss this painting with you, Kent Monkman, and also Bernard and John.
Thank you.
So thank you all for coming.
Yeah.